welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we sift through the sources, the dense historical documents, the research, and the arguments to extract the sharpest, most crucial insights for you.
Our mission is to make you instantly well-informed on the debates that shape our world, providing the context and the surprising facts that others often miss.
And today we are tackling one of the most persistent and, let's be honest, politically charged cultural flashpoints in American society.
The foundation of the country itself. We are diving deep into excerpts from Andrew L. Seidel's meticulously documented book, The Founding Myth, Why Christian Nationalism is Un-American.
The premise here is, it's pretty radical, especially if you grew up hearing the common narrative. Seidel's work is a direct challenge to the idea that the United States was established on Judeo-Christian principles.
It is, he argues, and we are going to explore his evidence today, that the principles of Christian nationalism are fundamentally opposed to the secular, reason-based foundations of the American experiment.
So our objective, just to be clear for everyone listening, isn't to take a side in this debate.
Not at all. Our goal is to really understand the specific historical and legal arguments that Seidel puts forward to support his claim. He sets out to prove that the U.S. was founded on the world's first secular constitution.
One that derives its authority not from heaven, but from
we, the people. The question we really have to dig into is, how effectively does the historical record, as he presents it, support the dismantling of this very persistent Christian nation myth?
It's a fascinating mission. The book kicks off by arguing that this entire Christian nation identity is built almost exclusively on fabricated history, on what the author calls persistent, comfortable myths. So let's unpack that core thesis right away.
Okay, so the central contention is crystal clear. First, the United States was not founded on Judeo-Christian principles, and the second part of that argument is just as forceful.
Which is that those principles, especially as defined by Christian nationalists today, are in direct conflict with the founding philosophy.
Exactly. They're diametrically opposed in many cases.
When we talk about Christian nationalism, we should probably define that. It's more than just being a Christian who happens to be American.
Oh, absolutely. Seidel defines it as a political project. It's an effort to fuse two distinct identities, Christian and American, so seamlessly that, in their view, you can't really be one without being the other.
It's an attempt to create a kind of single, religiously defined national identity.
Right, a meta-narrative, as some sociologists might call it. This narrative demands that America is fundamentally, and maybe exclusively, a Christian nation.
And so anyone who falls outside that definition, an atheist, a Jew, a Muslim, even a Christian who doesn't subscribe to this nationalist view,
is seen as inherently less American. It creates a hierarchy of citizenship based on religious identity.
and that need to claim religious exclusivity for a country that was really built on pluralism, that leads directly to manufacturing history, doesn't it?
It has to. The entire identity, as Seidel lays it out, is dependent on accepting historical falsehoods. And this brings us to a really brilliant quote from John F. Kennedy.
This was in 1962.
Yes. He was speaking about the enemy of truth. And he warned that the great enemy of truth is often not the deliberate lie, but the myth, persistent, persuasive, and unrealistic.
And he added that people often enjoy the comfort of opinion without the discomfort of thought.
That phrase, the comfort of opinion, it just resonates so much, doesn't it? It's much easier to accept a simple prepackaged story about the past than it is to engage with the messy, often contradictory details of the Enlightenment and the Revolutionary era.
Precisely. And this is where it gets dangerous, where these historical falsehoods become politically and legally potent. The source material highlights this terrifying power.
It's not just a cultural debate. These lies can actually influence court decisions. If a lawmaker passes something based on this revised history, or a judge cites a historical cliche about a Christian nation to uphold a law,
That ruling suddenly gives the myth a new foundation. It's no longer just an opinion.
it becomes precedent. It expands, lodging itself more firmly in the collective consciousness. It creates this kind of legal ratchet, as you said. A small distortion gets validated in law, and then it's used as the basis for the next bigger step.
And this mechanism is exactly what James Madison was afraid of.
All the way back in 1785, he wrote the Memorial and Remonstrance Against Religious Assessments. This was when Virginia was considering a bill. It was a small tax just to fund Christian ministers.
It seemed pretty minor, right? A 3-penny tax.
Seemingly insignificant. But Madison argued forcefully that you had to fight even this small infringement on principle, because if you let it stand, those small infringements become authority for future violations of our rights.
He knew. He knew that if you let even a tiny crack appear in that wall of separation,
Yeah.
people would try to drive a wedge through it.
Perpetually.
Yeah.
And that puts a huge amount of weight on what seem like these harmless little historical stories. And maybe none is more pervasive than the fabricated piety of George Washington.
Ah, the classic image. Washington kneeling in the snow at Valley Forge.
It's the ultimate comfortable myth. And the book traces its origin beautifully. That image of this stern, controlled, almost godlike leader suddenly softening in pious prayer.
It's pure fiction.
It is. And it wasn't some kind of accidental mistake that crept in over time. It was intentionally added to a popular book to make money.
The biographer was Mason Locke Weems, an Episcopal priest.
Right. And the story of Washington praying wasn't even in the first editions of his book. It was added by the 17th edition. Weems was, let's say, a savvy publisher. He knew there was a huge market. He wrote that millions are gaping to read something about him.
He wasn't just a biographer, he was a bit of a sensationalist. The book mentions he also published tracts on things like gambling and masturbation.
He knew what sold, piety and scandal, and he saw a market gap for a more overtly religious Washington, so he just inserted the scene.
The timing of when this myth really took off is significant too,
Oh, absolutely. The story truly cemented itself in the American psyche during the religious fervor of the Second Great Awakening.
which was roughly 1820 to 1860.
Exactly. And the existence of a Great Awakening itself kind of undermines the whole idea that the nation was founded on these deeply held Christian beliefs.
Because if you need a massive religious revival,
It strongly suggests that the previous generation, the founders' generation, was spiritually asleep. You can only awaken those who are sleeping.
and the actual historical evidence about Washington's faith is, well, it's the complete opposite of the myth.
It really is. People who knew him, like Bishop William White, said as much. Washington was not ostentatiously pious. He consistently refused to take communion.
He would actually walk out of the service before the sacrament.
He would. And Bishop White, who was close to him, stated that truth required him to say Washington was not a believer in Christian revelation. And if you look at Washington's will, there's no mention of Jesus or salvation. It's all very deist language.
So why does this myth persist? If the evidence is so clear, why is that image still hanging in the Capitol prayer room?
Because it serves a powerful political function. Washington was known for his stoicism, his incredible self-control. He was, to many, incomparable, almost inhumanly disciplined.
And the prayer myth humanizes him.
It does. It drags this stern, difficult, and self-controlled character, as the book calls him, down to a level that's understandable, that's imitable, and that allows a modern politician to claim piety, to kneel and pray, and suddenly they're on the same level as Washington.
It makes the incomparable founder approachable.
And it makes his piety an achievable political trait, which completely displaces the incredibly difficult, reasoned process of character construction that Washington actually embodied.
Okay, so if the myths are manufactured, let's look at the documents themselves. The book argues that the Constitution is the ultimate rebuttal to the Christian nation claim. It was born of reason, of political science, not divine revelation.
This is such a crucial distinction to make. We're talking about the Age of Enlightenment, the framers. They didn't see themselves as prophets getting guidance from on high.
They saw themselves as political scientists.
Exactly. They were drawing on the works of Locke, Montesquieu, and others. They used reason, history, and especially the negative experience of European governance to try and build a functional nation.
It was a fundamentally humanist project, and John Adams was incredibly strong on this point.
He was. Adams made it crystal clear that creating the American governments was a purely human effort. He insisted that it should never be pretended that any persons employed in that service had interviews with the gods.
Wow. So no divine intervention.
None. He said the governments were contrived merely by the use of reason and the senses. This wasn't an act of prayer or supplication. It was an act of political invention.
And that invention was explicitly viewed as an experiment.
Yes, that word is key. James Madison called it the great political experiment in the hands of the American people. An experiment implies you're testing something, you're refining it, you're applying scientific methods to theories of government.
Benjamin Franklin said the same thing, that improvement comes from making experiments.
It's a profoundly secular mindset. They approached governance with the methodical curiosity of the scientific revolution.
And the result of that process, according to Seidel, is what he calls the godless Constitution. And the authority for it is stated right up front in those first three words.
We, the people. That phrase is a world historical rejection of theocracy and the divine right of kings. It's an explicit declaration that government authority flows from humanity, from the governed.
And that stands in direct contradiction to Christian principles of governmental authority.
Absolutely. The biblical tradition, for example, in the book of Proverbs, asserts, by me, meaning by the biblical God, kings reign. The model in Europe for centuries was that rulers answered only to God.
So the American Constitution just severs that chain of command entirely.
Completely. It's a document of human supremacy in the political sphere. And when you see it from that perspective, the absence of religious language becomes, well, it's clearly intentional.
It's stunning. I mean, if you believe the U.S. was founded as a Christian nation, you have to explain why the original document never once mentions God, Jesus, Yahweh, or the Ten Commandments.
It's an absence that screams louder than any presence could. It signifies an intentional break.
And the only times religion is mentioned in the original text are actually exclusionary. There's structural safeguards.
Exactly. The framers didn't just ignore religion, they actively wove separation into the design. The most emphatic statement of this, even before the Bill of Rights, is in Article 6, Clause 3.
The prohibition on religious tests for public office.
Seidel calls it the most emphatic statement in the document. It was revolutionary. The founders were saying that your faith, or lack of it, has no bearing on your ability to serve. Your qualifications are all that matter.
And then, of course, you get the First Amendment, which builds that separation into a two-way street.
A dual mechanism. You have the Establishment Clause, which stops the state from establishing or endorsing a religion.
So government is protected from religion.
And then you have the Free Exercise Clause, which stops the state from interfering with private religious practice.
And religion is protected from government. It's that wall of separation.
Right. And while that phrase is famously from Jefferson, it was really Madison who provided the intellectual and political firepower for it.
In that memorial and remonstrance we mentioned earlier.
Yes, from 1785.
Yeah.
It remains the definitive defense of separation. The Supreme Court cites it constantly when interpreting the First Amendment. It lays out all the deep historical anxieties the founders had about fusing political and religious power.
And Madison wasn't just worried about persecution. He was worried about the institutional corruption it causes for both sides.
His analysis is so pragmatic. He looked back at 1,500 years of state-backed Christianity in Europe and listed its fruits. He said it produced pride and indolence in the clergy, ignorance and servility in the laity, in both superstition, bigotry, and persecution.
He saw it as a corrupting force that led to moral and intellectual decay.
But he also saw how rulers benefited. He argued that tyrants seeking to subvert the public liberty often found that an established clergy made for convenient auxiliaries.
State religion provides moral cover for tyranny.
It does. And conversely, he said the government should never legislate religious matters because for a politician to do so implies that the civil magistrate is a competent judge of religious truth.
Which Madison called an arrogant pretension.
It's the ultimate statement of secular humility. The government is simply incompetent to legislate faith. By building that wall, you protect both realms. The state from religious manipulation and religion from state corruption.
Okay, so since the Constitution is so demonstrably secular, the argument often pivots to the Declaration of Independence.
Right, because the Declaration has those famous religious-sounding phrases. Nature's God, creator. This is where Christian nationalists often feel they have their proof.
But Seidel argues we have to analyze the document's revolutionary philosophy first. What was its purpose?
Jefferson himself was very clear about this nearly 50 years after he wrote it. He said he wrote it not to find out new principles, but to place before mankind the common sense of the subject.
It wasn't laying a new spiritual foundation. It was justifying a political act that was already happening.
Exactly. It was justifying revolution and independence. And that justification rested on these radical Enlightenment ideals, that despotic governments should be overthrown and that power resides in the consent of the governed.
And this is where Seidel makes his most challenging claim, that the Declaration, philosophically, is an anti-Christian document with snippets of illegal-sounding language as window dressing.
And the reason he says that is simple. The core ideas of political revolution and self-government are, in his analysis, fundamentally anti-biblical.
That's a huge claim. Why would revolution be anti-biblical?
Because biblical authority, especially in the New Testament, is explicit about demanding obedience to existing rulers, no matter how tyrannical they are.
You're talking about Romans 13.
That's the prime example. It states unequivocally that the powers that be are ordained of God. Therefore, to rebel against the state is to rebel against God himself. The philosophy demands loyalty and submission even to an abusive power.
Like the story of Job, who keeps worshiping God despite horrific, unwarranted abuse.
Precisely. The biblical mandate is theological submission. But what does the Declaration demand? It declares that after a long train of abuses and usurpations, it is the people's right, and in fact their duty, to throw off such government.
It's a complete rejection of that model.
A complete rejection of the divine right of kings and the theological requirement of submission. The Declaration is a philosophy of popular rebellion. The biblical mandates, as interpreted by Seidel, support authoritarianism.
Okay, if the philosophy is anti-biblical, then what about those four famous religious references? Nature's God, Creator, Supreme Judge, and Providence.
The key, he argues, is their calculated generality. Not one of them names Jesus, Yahweh, or the specific Christian God. The framers intentionally chose these broad, generic terms that were consistent with deism.
Deism being the belief, common among the intellectual elite at the time, that a creator exists but doesn't actively intervene in human affairs.
Right, they eschewed any invocation of the Christian religion. And this intentional avoidance of Christianity is really brought into sharp relief by something Jefferson originally included in his draft.
The part about King George III.
It's a blistering critique. Jefferson's original draft explicitly condemns King George III as a Christian king for perpetuating the slave trade.
He even contrasts him with so-called infidel powers.
Yes, meaning non-Christian nations, probably North African Muslim states, who loathed the slave trade, while this Christian king was actively promoting it. It's a moment where Jefferson is explicitly chastising Christian morality itself.
And even though that passage was removed to get the southern colonies on board, it reveals the author's initial moral calculus.
It does. And beyond that, Seidel argues that the final generic references were an act of strategic piety. It was a smart rhetorical move. The audience was, in part, King George III, a deeply devout Christian. If you're trying to convince him he's wrong, what better way than to appeal to a higher power, even his own? It's an intelligent way to justify revolution to a global audience.
There's also one subtle but really crucial linguistic detail. The Declaration refers to their creator, not our creator.
That is so significant. Christian nationalists often misquote it as our creator. But since the document was addressed to the entire world, choosing their recognizes that different people and different nations have their own valid views of a creator.
Whether that concept is religious or naturalistic or just philosophical.
Right. It grounds rights in the act of being human, not in subscribing to a single specific creed, which is exactly what Christian nationalism seeks to undermine.
Let's pivot now to the idea of morality itself. Christian nationalists often claim that without Christianity, the founders would have had no moral compass.
And that the U.S. would descend into chaos. Seidel argues that morality is a human achievement, totally independent of divine guidance.
He finds the claim of divine inspiration almost disrespectful.
Disrespectful on two levels. First, it diminishes the incredible intellectual and physical work of the actual people who made the revolution happen. Washington, Madison, Jefferson. The credit, he says, should go to human effort, not some invisible deity.
There's that great anecdote about Ethan Allen.
Yes, after he captured Fort Ticonderoga, a preacher comes up to him and starts shouting, giving all the glory for the victory to God.
And Allen yells back, "Don't forget, Parson, that I was there."
It's a perfect little story that captures that secular founding mentality. Humans did the work, so humans deserve the credit.
And the second level of the argument is that the founders themselves, the educated elite, were often deists or held other unorthodox beliefs. They were perfectly moral without orthodox Christian dogma.
That's the key. If the elite felt they only needed basic deism or natural law to be moral, and only believed that the commoners needed the fear of hell to keep them in line.
Well, that actually proves morality is possible without revealed religion.
It's an elitist view, maybe, but it confirms the core thesis. Morality is a human achievement. And this isn't just a historical argument. Modern sociological data seems to back this up.
Seidel cites the sociologist Phil Zuckerman,
whose research shows a pretty clear correlation between secularism and overall societal health. If you look at murder rates globally, they are lower in more secular nations.
and that pattern holds true within the U.S. as well.
It does. The highest murder rates are in highly religious states like Louisiana and Alabama. The lowest rates are in the least religious states like Vermont and Oregon. It's a stark contradiction to the myth that you need religion for societal cohesion.
And it's not just murder rates.
No. When you look at a whole host of factors, violent crime, corruption, women's rights, education, the least religious countries consistently score better. It suggests that our human capacity for moral behavior, guided by reason and law, is sufficient.
So if morality is a universal human achievement, what about the Golden Rule? That's always held up as the prime example of Judeo-Christian moral superiority.
And the evidence that it's uniquely or originally Judeo-Christian is, well, it's non-existent. The principle is truly universal.
How far back does it go?
We find it in ancient Egyptian texts from maybe 2040 BCE. In ancient Greece, philosophers like Thales and Plato were articulating it in the 6th century BCE. At the same time in China, you have Laozi, Confucius, and Mozi teaching it. It's in Hindu scriptures, too. It was a principle of natural law and philosophy long before the Bible.
And the book points out that the biblical formulation is actually more limited.
Yes. The Jewish formulation in Leviticus is often contextually limited to your kin, your people, or your neighbor, which in that context often meant a fellow believer. This makes the biblical version an in-group morality.
Whereas the founders were relying on a universal ethical principle of natural law.
Precisely. And John Adams understood this perfectly. He wrote that the Golden Rule is a principle of the law of nature and nations. He saw that Christianity was just a vehicle for spreading this universal idea to the masses, but the idea itself came from human reason, not divine revelation.
All right, this brings us to the ultimate clash. The Ten Commandments versus the Constitution. This is where the claim that America was founded on biblical law really gets tested.
And Seidel argues that the claim is weak from the get-go because the Bible itself can't even agree on what the Ten Commandments are. The book notes there are actually 4 different sets of them in the Bible.
4 different versions.
With subtle but significant variations. For example, the second set, in Exodus 34, includes a prohibition on boiling a young goat in its mother's milk. So the idea of a single unified moral code is already problematic, but the core argument is even stronger.
Which is that every one of the standard 10 commandments would be unconstitutional in the American system.
Every single one, when you examine it closely.
Let's start with the big one, the first commandment. You shall have no other gods before me.
This is the fundamental conflict. The command mandates the establishment of a single religious authority. It's a direct, flagrant violation of the First Amendment's Establishment Clause and Free Exercise Clause.
The American system guarantees the freedom not to worship, or to worship any god, or multiple gods.
So they're in immediate, explicit contradiction. The authority of the commandment rests on a divine claim of supremacy. The authority of the Constitution rests on the supremacy of we the people. They are 2 entirely different legal universes.
Okay, what about the second commandment, the one prohibiting idols?
Yeah.
The book says this is where the conflict with American justice becomes most profound.
Yes, because the text contains this truly horrific condition. God is a jealous God, punishing children for the iniquity of parents to the 3rd and the 4th generation. It enshrines vicarious punishment. The sins of the father are literally visited upon the children.
And the Constitution has a specific clause designed to prevent exactly that.
It does. Article 3, Section 3 deals with treason, and it explicitly states, no attainder of treason shall work corruption of blood.
Let's unpack corruption of blood. What does that mean?
It was a feature of Old English law. If you committed treason, not only would you forfeit your property, but your descendants would be blocked from inheriting land. It condemned the whole family for generations.
It punished innocent children for the crimes of their parent.
Exactly. And the founders, remembering the political and religious tyrannies of Europe, made sure to outlaw it. The only person you can punish is the guilty party. The biblical God's constant practice of punishing the innocent, killing Egypt's firstborn, the infants in Noah's flood, is completely antithetical to the bedrock of American justice.
Then there's the third commandment about not taking God's name in vain. This is basically a blasphemy law.
And the founders viewed blasphemy laws as tools of persecution. John Adams pointed out that in Europe, punishment for blasphemy could be fire, or the rack, or the wheel. He called these laws great obstructions to the improvement of the human mind.
And the Supreme Court has been very clear on this.
Absolutely. The court has ruled again and again that it's not the government's business to suppress attacks on religious doctrine. Blasphemy laws are fundamentally un-American. They violate the First Amendment.
Now, what about the ones that seem the most universal? The prohibitions on killing, theft, and lying.
Seidel argues that even these are unconstitutional in their biblical context because of that principle of in-group morality. They applied only to your neighbor, which, as we said, often meant only fellow believers.
And the biblical record is immediately contradictory.
Right. The biblical God commands mass killings and genocides against non-believers right after giving the law. The morality is tribal. The Constitution, on the other hand, applies its laws universally to everyone within its jurisdiction.
The biblical view of punishment also conflicts with the Eighth Amendment. No cruel and unusual punishments.
A huge conflict. Biblical justice is savage by modern standards. It prescribes stoning for premarital sex or for a rape victim who doesn't cry out loud enough. But the ultimate conflict is the Christian tenet of eternal hellfire.
An infinite punishment for a finite crime.
It's the definition of disproportional punishment, which the Eighth Amendment forbids. The Supreme Court itself said back in 1890 that punishments like burning at the stake or crucifixion would be instantly unconstitutional.
Finally, let's look at the Seventh and Tenth Commandments, which deal with marriage, property, and, crucially, the status of women.
This is where the biblical text directly enshrines patriarchy. The Seventh Commandment prohibiting adultery biblically only applied to a married woman and her partner. A husband sleeping around was not considered adultery.
Because it was seen as a crime against the husband's property.
Exactly. He owned his wife.
Yeah.
And this is explicitly confirmed in the 10th Commandment, which forbids coveting.
It lists a wife along with other property?
It does. The text says, "You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife or male or female slave or ox or donkey." The wife is classified as chattel on the same level as livestock.
And this religious belief system had devastating real-world legal effects in America for a long time.
It provided an unassailable moral justification for oppression. It was the basis for the legal doctrine of coverture, where a married woman had no legal existence separate from her husband. And it was explicitly used by the Supreme Court in the 19th century to deny women the right to practice law, citing the divine ordinance that women belong in a separate sphere.
The biblical view acted as a political brake on equal rights.
It did. And the last point on the 10th Commandment is its ban on coveting, which is essentially a ban on thought.
Thought crime.
The defining feature of totalitarian regimes, like in Orwell's 1984, these systems maintain power by making followers feel perpetually guilty for their internal impulses. The First Amendment, in total contrast, absolutely protects freedom of thought. You cannot be punished for what you think.
So it's clear the Ten Commandments and the Constitution are incompatible. And yet, the myth of the Christian nation persists, largely because of slogans and symbols that sound ancient, but are actually much more recent.
This is the argument that these phrases are entirely context-dependent. They were introduced during times of national fear or crisis to impose a religious identity onto the public sphere.
"In God we trust" is the classic example.
It first appeared on coins in 1863 during the Civil War. It only became the official national motto in 1956 during the height of the Red Scare.
And the original motto was totally different.
The original 1787 copper cent had Benjamin Franklin's pragmatic mottos, "Fugio, mind your business, and we are one." A message of unity and commercial practicality was replaced with a religious assertion that, by definition, excludes people.
The Pledge of Allegiance had a similar fear-driven makeover.
Yes. One nation under God was inserted in 1954.
Yeah.
The original pledge from 1892, written by a Baptist minister no less, celebrated one nation, indivisible. The change was driven by Cold War paranoia.
The logic was to equate atheism with communism.
Exactly. Proponents explicitly argued that an atheistic American is a contradiction in terms, so challenging this new religious language became politically dangerous. It silenced opposition.
And even a phrase we hear constantly from politicians, "God bless America."
It's also a relatively modern tool. The first president to consistently close speeches with it was Richard Nixon, and he did so during the worst of the Watergate scandal. It was a strategic, maybe cynical, attempt to rally religious support.
None of these phrases date to the founding era.
Not at all.
And speaking of how religion can warp American values, the book points to the Civil War as a devastating example, especially regarding slavery.
It's a tragic demonstration. Critically, the pro-slavery forces successfully argued that the Bible supported slavery. They cited chapter and verse, noted that Jesus never preached against it, and pointed out that the biblical gods sanctioned it.
So abolitionists were often branded as anti-biblical or even atheists?
They were. So biblical morality provided the justification for a practice that inherently violated the Declaration's promise of inalienable rights. This is the profound difficulty the founders themselves faced. Jefferson wrote about liberty but owned slaves. He even wrote, "I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just."
It's an incredible paradox. And this brings us to modern tactics. The book details Project Blitz.
Project Blitz is a highly coordinated legislative push to codify Christian privilege into law today. It's a systematic effort, state by state, to redefine America's identity.
And it uses a three-category approach.
Yes. Category 1 is all about heritage. These are bills to promote the historical myths mandating "In God We Trust" displays in every public school and library.
Seemingly harmless stuff.
On the surface. Category 2 is proclamations. This is recognizing things like Christian Heritage Week or listing questionable historical facts like claiming the first act of Congress was prayer to imply a foundational religious intent.
The third category is the real goal.
Category 3 is where they grant a legal license to discriminate. These are bills that allow religious organizations to refuse services to people, often targeting LGBTQ Americans. For example, allowing an adoption agency to refuse a same-sex couple.
So the strategy is to use the seemingly benign Category 1 and 2 bills
to warp the national sense of history, creating a manufactured historical precedent that they can then use to legitimize the exclusionary and discriminatory agenda of Category 3. It's a long game.
If these historical myths and modern legislative tactics succeed, what are the ultimate implications for American democracy? For equal rights?
The primary implication is the ongoing erosion of secularism, which in turn erodes equality. When the government bases its laws on Judeo-Christian morality, it inevitably creates unconstitutional laws that target specific groups.
We see this all through the history of civil rights.
Think about anti-miscegenation laws, the kind overturned in Loving v. Virginia, or anti-sodomy laws. The Supreme Court, when it finally struck those down, noted that the historical justification for them was firmly rooted in Judeo-Christian moral and ethical standards.
So when the state intrudes on these deeply personal freedoms, the justification is almost always religious morality, which is not a sufficient legal basis for American law.
Legally insufficient. But there's also a chilling effect. The fear of appearing anti-religious often silences legitimate challenges. Take congressional chaplains. James Madison called the practice a palpable violation of equal rights.
Yet the Supreme Court upheld it.
In 1983, in Marsh v. Chambers, and they did it simply by citing the long, if constitutionally dubious, history of the practice. Once a breach in the wall is allowed to stand for long enough, it gains the legitimacy of tradition.
The book also touches on a very personal conflict. The tension between biblical morality and human moral progress often played out inside a single family.
This is a really powerful observation. The example is a politician who supports marriage equality only after their own son or daughter comes out as gay. They often try to reframe this shift as still being compatible with their religious values.
But Seidel argues that choosing love and acceptance in that moment is actually an exercise of human morality, not Christian morality.
Exactly. By modern standards, many tenets of traditional Christianity are profoundly anti-family. Jesus demanded followers prioritize him above all else to set a man against his father. When a parent chooses to embrace their gay child, they are performing a profoundly human moral act, often in direct opposition to the textual demands of their religion. It reinforces the idea that moral progress exists outside of, and sometimes in spite of, religious rigidity. So we've really covered the full scope of Seidel's argument, from the manufactured myths about Washington through the secular design of the Constitution to the incompatibility of the Ten Commandments with American law, and finally to modern tactics like Project Blitz. This deep dive shows that the book presents a robust, historically detailed challenge to that Christian nation myth.
And separating this historical fact from persistent, comfortable myth isn't just an intellectual exercise. It is absolutely crucial for defending equal rights, for ensuring legal impartiality, and for maintaining the constitutional integrity you need for a pluralistic society. Understanding these myths is the first step in dismantling the ideological foundation for exclusionary legislation. And here is a final provocative thought for you to explore on your own. If the American experiment is fundamentally dedicated to the capacity of mankind for self-government and moral improvement, how should a society founded on reason reconcile itself with the profound paradoxes of its own founders? We know they established revolutionary political liberty, but they failed to extend that liberty universally. Jefferson owned slaves while writing that all men are created equal. The framers ignored Abigail Adams' plea to remember the ladies. The source material shows that the founding was a human endeavor, dedicated to self-improvement but susceptible to massive moral failures, rooted in historical and religious justifications for oppression. So if the American project is truly dedicated to reason, our highest duty must be to continue the moral progress that the founders, despite their genius, were unable to complete, by consistently challenging accepted traditions and historical narratives that prevent the universal application of liberty. Where do you see the next great moral failure that America has yet to reconcile?